All right, we're launching a brand new teaching series today called This is War, and the idea behind it is we're going to be looking at kind of the spiritual realm and spiritual warfare, and the tagline of this series is Preparing Our Souls for Battle. And whenever we start talking about things that are spiritual, and you kind of leave the physical world or the physical realm, and you start talking about things that are going on behind the scenes and things that are going on that are unseen, people usually gravitate to one or two camps, and they're usually different forms of extremes. And so some people would say, oh yeah, talk about the spiritual stuff because spiritual warfare is all around us, but they tend to hyper-spiritualize everything. And everything is like, oh no, the devil's trying to attack me. Oh, I got a paper cut, that must be the devil. No, your motor skills may be off and you're kind of clumsy. You may stub your toe, and it doesn't have to be the devil, just your lack of spatial awareness. Video doesn't play before the sermon right, ain't the devil. It's like we're hitting the wrong buttons, potentially. I can't tell you how many times I've got up to preach and my microphone wouldn't work. You know why? Because I didn't turn the mute off. It's user error. So things like happen in our world, and we don't have to hyper-spiritualize things. And what happens over time is if everything is spiritual and everything boils down to what's the devil or his demons or spiritual warfare, then really nothing does. So sometimes we make mistakes, sometimes we drop the ball, and sometimes it's just us, being silly or whatever that causes different problems in our lives. But on the flip side, the other camp, and if I had to pick one or two of them, or of the two, I lean more this way. Some people just deny the spiritual realm altogether, like it doesn't exist. So the devil didn't give you a paper cut, but he is still moving and active in your life, and you need to be aware of that. And there are forces, there are things going on behind the scenes that you are not prepared for if you're not mindful that there is a spiritual world and a spiritual realm. And so some people are like, no, I'm logical, I'm analytical, I'm an adult now, I don't believe in that stuff and the fairy tales and all this minutia. It's like, no, when we're adults now, right? Don't we forget, or don't we stop believing in the devil and demons? And no, you can't. Because the Bible kind of paints for us a clear picture that there is a spiritual world that we have to be mindful of. Now, here's the thing about it. And Dan, I've lost the ability to use my slides. If you can run back there. See, it's not the devil, I don't think. Could be. Ooh, I don't know. See, here's the thing about it, though, is that if we are not prepared for the life that is around us, both the physical and the spiritual, we do miss out on being ready to take on the enemy and to be prepared for what the enemy throws at us. So here's the big idea for the entire series. We live in a physical world affected by a spiritual realm. So what we see, what we occupy, what we experience on a day-to-day basis, that's the physical world that we live in. That's what we know. When we're hungry, we eat something. And when we're tired, we go to sleep. And it's like we're always interacting with the physical world. But what we don't understand is that the spiritual realm is constantly affecting the physical world, both for the good and the bad. Now, kind of the lifeblood of this series, if you will, and kind of the main verses that kind of brought about this idea in the series and all the stuff that went before it is Ephesians chapter 6, verses 10 through 12. So the Apostle Paul is speaking about the spiritual reality, and here's what he says. Finally, be strong in the Lord and in His mighty power. And we're going to talk more about this, I think, in weeks 3 and 4. But to be strong in the Lord and in His mighty power, I want you to think about how mighty and powerful the Lord is and what we have at our disposal or what we have access to. That the God who spoke things into existence, that's the mighty power that the Apostle Paul is asking us to tap into. And one of the ways that we do that is we put on the full armor of God so that we can take our stand against the devil's schemes. So the devil is scheming. He wants to destroy humanity. He wants to hurt people who follow God. You got to be mindful of it. You got to put on the armor so that you're ready to go. And then Paul kind of gives us this reality check. He says, for our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. So our struggle, we may think that we've got different issues in our lives, and they can be traced back to physical conditions, or they can be traced back to, different problems. You think about America, and America has foreign enemies, all this stuff. Paul's like, peel back all those layers. There is spiritual war going on all around us, and you can win physical battles all day long. But if you lose the spiritual ones, you're losing the most important battles that are out there. So here's where we're going to go over the course of this series. Next weekend, I think, this isn't set in stone. It's written in pencil in my notebook so I can change it quickly. Next week, we're going to talk about the enemy, kind of like a scouting report. We're going to talk about the devil and his demons and the way that they try to harm us and how active they are and what they actually do. Because I would imagine I'm just curious, how many of you have ever heard a sermon on the devil and demons? So a few. So that's something we got to talk about, because when you start preparing for a basketball game, or when you prepare to go to war, you got to know who you're going up against and what strengths and weaknesses they have and how they're going to try to attack and where their defenses are weak and all that type of stuff. So next week we're going to do a scouting report. After that, we're going to talk about our responsibility. It's like, okay, this is how the devil's going to attack you. This is how you are victorious in those moments and in those attacks. And so that'll be the weeks to follow. But here's where I want to start with our conversation today. And we're not jumping into the deep end right away. We're just kind of easing into the water, so to speak. As we begin, I want to discuss how the spiritual forces of good interact with our physical world. We're going to talk about the negative and how we prepare for the negative, but we've got to start by addressing and discussing how God interacts with our physical world. Because when we start talking about the negative, you may feel overwhelmed. You may feel outmatched. And what you got to know is the God who is the creator and the God who, made all things loves us more than we could ever imagine. He fights on our behalf regularly, and God is constantly moving and interacting with our world in big, awesome, amazing ways. And the thing that we're going to do as we walk through, we're going to go over 4 different ways that God interacts with the world. And you may feel like, as we walk through it, that you're sitting in a lesson or a lecture. And different, people learn different ways. And by nature, I'm a teacher, and I like to teach, and sometimes that gets me in trouble because I start teaching on things that people are like, I don't really care, and I don't know why that even has an impact in my life. Now, some of you are going to get your notepads out, and you're going to get your pen, and you're like, oh, okay, yeah, I'm going to write all this stuff down. Some of you are going to be like, oh, I wish football was on later today, or you'll be thinking about whatever it is that you think about. But here's what I'm asking. I want you to hang with me. Because though you may like, this is a lot of information, and these are a lot of terms, and how do I organize all this? I'm going to try to connect all the dots as we get to the end, hopefully connect some of the dots throughout as well. And this is stuff that we need to be mindful of, and we need to be aware of, and you may not necessarily need it as much now, but there will be a season in your life when you're definitely going to need it. So let's talk about how God interacts with the world. Here's the first way. General providence. People a lot smarter than me have given these terms. So I'm just grabbing how they have categorized these things and just copying and pasting essentially. General providence is the way that God keeps the world going, even though you think it's just natural that it's going to always exist or go that way. Let me explain it by reading from the Apostle Paul. This is Colossians chapter 1. Paul says, "For in him," that's Jesus, "in him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities, all things have been created through him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together." So everything in, our world, anything on planet Earth, from gravity to atoms to just everything, owes its existence to Jesus. Jesus is the creating agent of all things. Not only does he have a hand in creating everything, but he has a hand in sustaining everything to make sure everything goes the way it's supposed to go. So you and I take for granted different realities of our world, like let's just say gravity, for instance. Like when I jump up, I've never once been afraid that I'm not going to stop going up and then I'm going to end up going into space and floating around or whatever. Because I just know when I jump up, Gravity's going to bring me down. Now, it seems like in the last 20 years, gravity's gotten a little bit stronger than it used to be because I don't get off the ground as quickly as I did and as high as I did, and I come down a little bit harder, it seems like. But gravity has been 9.8 meters per second squared on all objects for like the dawn of creation. That's just what gravity does. And you say, well, gravity just exists, and we don't need Jesus to make sure gravity exists. And what Paul says is, you do. What you don't realize is if Jesus went on vacation, or if Jesus took a nap, or if Jesus just walked away from all that he created, things would just start falling apart really quickly. And the psalmist will talk about things like, being thankful that we even have breath in our lungs. And somebody who may be like, well, you don't have to thank Jesus for breath in your lungs because like our bodies are created so that oxygen can go in, our lungs can take those and send those out to the blood cells, and then the heart passes all the oxygen through, so we have movement for all this. And you can give a scientific explanation. That's the way that Jesus set it up to work, but without Jesus it doesn't work. So general providence is Jesus has a hand in everything existing, and Jesus has a hand in everything continuing to exist. And it teaches us, I hope, not to take things for granted. Just because they're there doesn't mean there isn't somebody working behind the scenes to make sure that they're there. Heat is a good example of that. Anybody have no heat for a short period of time this week? And you're like, I'm worried something's going to freeze. I'm worried about the pipes. And heat came on quick because there are people out there working. It's like you take it for granted because it's just always there. When you push a button, the heat comes on. But whenever the heat goes away, or if your AC goes away when it's really hot outside, you're like, oh my goodness, I'm thankful for all the times that I've had heat or air conditioning. And we need to take a step back and be thankful for the way that Jesus is always working behind the scenes to keep the things going, the way that we think are just always going to go or always just going to be around. Jesus holds all these things together. Now, number 2, after general providence is specific providence. This is Jesus or God moving and interacting with humanity, but doing so within the laws of nature, doing so within the natural order of things, bringing about things in your life that can happen naturally, but he orchestrates it so that it will happen. Examples of this would be like when nations come to power or when kings come to power, or you may look throughout your life and you can see that at different points that God's got his fingerprints all over your life or all over your past, so that your career choices or where you moved or who you married or just different things that have happened, you're like, man, God was behind all of that, and he was kind of guiding me and directing my path. I didn't even realize it was happening because it was done, and with hindsight I can see it, but that's an example of specific providence. So, in the Old Testament it was, well, God tells Israel, I'm going to make you a great nation. I'm going to drive out all the nations before you so that you can inhabit the land that I promised to your forefathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Well, those types of things happen naturally in that you see nations come to power and you see nations take over land and you see kingdoms fall at different times. But specific providence is God taking something that can happen and making sure that something specific happens, either with a nation or in our lives. And so I think the founding of our nation, the founding of America, I believe is an example of specific providence. God setting us up to be a light to the other nations, to almost like the torch passing, if you will, from like a physical nation of Israel, and eventually you have America, which is supposed to be founded on Christian principles, doing Christian things so that the rest of the world can see. This is what living as a Christian nation is supposed to look like. And specific providence in your life, there are so many times where your path has been guided and directed and crises have been averted because God is there and protecting you. Now, I will say this as well. That when you look in your life, a part of your story, there is pain and there is hurt. And you're like, well, why did God? If God's always, then why did he allow these different things to happen? And there are lots of different explanations for that. And I don't want to give pat answers, but let me just say this in brief, and it won't be enough, but if you want to talk to me afterwards, you can. 2 things. Number 1, spiritual growth happens more in pain than it does in paradise. God's biggest MO for us, God's biggest concern for us is that we grow closer to him. And we hear him more and experience him more during moments of pain and chaos and torment, if you will, than we do when everything's going really, really well. That's why James, the half-brother of Jesus, says, "Consider it pure joy, my brothers, when you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith builds up perseverance." You know, in sports, I use a lot of sports analogies, I know, but you don't make practices as easy as possible on your players because you think that's what's better. No, you make it as hard as possible, and you run them more than they think they can run, and through the suffering and through the pain, a stronger team is built. It's the same with us. And the other thing I'll say is that when bad things happen, God is not causing those bad things to happen. We're going to talk about that next week a little bit. But in allowing bad things to happen, not only to us as individuals, but the world, we get a glimpse of what removing God from everything actually looks like. And God cannot say, okay, now that you're a Christian, I'm going to protect you from all hurt and pain and heartache, because then people would try to become Christians or Jesus followers just to have like a heaven experience on earth. God has promised us heaven. And we get to spend forever in his presence. And there may be some tough years, however long you're on planet Earth, but that fails to compare to how awesome heaven's going to be. So look for later as opposed to now. But the specific providence is God cares enough and loves enough that he involves himself in our lives. Not on a week-to-week basis, not on a day-to-day, but on a moment-to-moment basis. There is never a point in your life where God's watchful eyes are not on you. And he loves you more than you could ever imagine. And there are 7 billion-ish people on planet Earth. God knows how many hairs are on everybody's head. He knows everybody's hurt, everybody's pain. He knows the exciting moments because he experienced all of that with us. And the God who created everything actually cares about you more than you could even process. And so like the general providence, like God is continuing to allow time to go on and creation to exist by sustaining it all. And then in your lives and in our lives, he interacts with them and changes trajectory sometimes, and he's always working for the good, Paul says in Romans. He's always working for the good of those who love him. And I hope that you're encouraged by that today. Earth isn't something that God just kind of started spinning at the right, rotation so that gravity holds everything on there and, okay, now we're good. Let's go on vacation. That was a lot of work. Like God's involved each and every moment of your day. Now, the third way that God interacts is usually what we think of. When we think of spiritual forces of good interacting with the physical world, we think of miracles. We think of the miraculous events. Now, in order for something to be a miracle, it has to be visible, and it has to be like a breach or breaking the natural laws. Jesus walking on water isn't just like specific providence, him doing something that would have happened naturally. No matter how light you are on your feet, you're not walking on water. No matter how much you can throw a staff into water, you're not parting seas and having them like be held in suspension. Miracles are God interacting with the world and breaking, if you will, the laws of nature, or doing things outside of what can even happen naturally. And there's a reason for miracles. The author of Hebrews says this salvation, of course he's talking about the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus, this salvation which was first announced by the Lord was confirmed to us by those who heard him. God also testified to it. That is the salvation and the message of salvation. He testified to it by signs, wonders, and various miracles, and by gifts of the Holy Spirit distributed according to his will. So miracles exist as a sign to point people back to the validity of the message of Jesus' coming and his death, burial, and resurrection. And all throughout the book of Acts, you can see time and time again. So when the apostles going into an area, they're talking about Jesus, and people are like, who's Jesus, and what's this new teaching? And then they start performing miracles, and people's ears perk up, and they actually pay attention. Because when the teaching is accompanied by miracles, it validates the testimony. It validates the truth behind the teaching. And so all the book of Acts is just filled with this as example after example after example. Now, the question that people often have is, how often do we see miracles in our world today? And then as a carryover of that, why don't we see things happening in America the way that we see them happening in the Bible? Well, there are several answers to that. One, I'll point to what the Bible is, which is a collection of events and stories that actually happen, but, they're retelling of historical events, but it covers the span of several thousand years. And so when you're reading the Bible and you see miracle after miracle after miracle, understand that that is the exception, not the rule. Understand that there are a lot of days that are just normal that just happen for hundreds of years. And there seems to be silence from God, and there's no miraculous events. They only record for us the big stuff. They don't point out people's lives. It's they got up early, they read their Bible, they went to work, they conquered a certain sin or whatever. Well, no, we can't talk about all of those events. Let's talk about the big ones. So you're watching or reading the highlight reel of God interacting with humanity both in the Old and New Testaments. You're not seeing the day-to-day faithful obedience in ordinary life, which we always need to be mindful of. And so some of it is, there's thousands of years covered here, and yeah, you see a lot of miracles, but divide that by how many people and how many years, and the equation is you're not going to see a lot on a day-to-day basis, even though it feels like that. So that's number one. But number two, I do think it's interesting that in our culture and in our time period and in our nation, because we de-spiritualize everything or we under-spiritualize everything at the fear of maybe over-spiritualizing, I think sometimes when there is a miraculous event, we try to explain it away through natural terms. And I think also because we don't expect to see things, sometimes things just don't happen. It reminds me of Mark 6 when Jesus goes back to Nazareth. That's his hometown. He begins to teach the people. And they looked at him with kind of some anger. And they're like, he's one of us. We know, they're his brothers. There's his mom and sisters. Who are you to come and tell us to repent? The kingdom of heaven is near. You're not better than us. You're one of us. He can't be the Messiah. And they doubted who he claimed to be. And it said that Jesus was amazed at their lack of faith. So he's amazed at their lack of faith, and he was only able to perform just a few simple miracles there because of their lack of faith. And I think that we collectively, the church in America, so not just we, but we, all of us, we tend to lack faith in that way. And we tend to try to explain things away from, in a natural way when maybe there's something supernatural going on. But then also, we don't actually expect God to do any big miraculous events. And just like the people 2,000 years ago in Nazareth who doubted Jesus, didn't expect him to do anything, and that somehow, I won't say it handcuffed his power, but it removed the opportunity for God's blessing to come upon them. I think that same thing can happen today. We want to be careful of that. We want to be mindful of that. I don't want us to over-spiritualize everything, but you got to understand, we live in a physical world affected by the spiritual realm, and God is constantly moving, and he wants to move on our behalf. Now, some people have a problem with miracles. Let me just step out of our flow for a second and address those of you who are yeah, I've read the Noah story, and Joshua and the sun standing still, and David being thrown in the lion's den, and he wasn't eaten up, and those were cool when I was a kid, and those were interesting stories. But Doug, you don't actually believe that those miracles happen, do you? You don't actually believe in the miraculous because you seem like a really intelligent, logical guy, guilty as charged, by the way. But more than that, really? What else are you going to start believing in? Well, here's where I kind of start with and how I say, I completely and totally believe all the miracles of the Bible. You don't have to right away, by the way. But for me, it started when I was a sophomore in college. I was sitting in a philosophy of religion class, and the professor liked to pick on Christians, okay? And so He found out I was because I'm always wearing some Christian Jesus t-shirt. Like even now, like my wardrobe is Woodlawn Cardinals basketball and Woodlawn Christian Church, and that's basically all I wear. So he would see me wearing stuff, and so he'd kind of poke at me a little bit, and he's like, so let me get this straight. You believe that God just at some point said, let there be light, and then poof, there's light. And then God started to form things, and the land and the sea, and that, eventually God made human beings, and you think that God did all this stuff when science can kind of explain it for? I said, well, how does science explain it? He's like, well, matter and stuff was contained in one central location. I'm like, well, how did that get there? How did the matter get there? And the Big Bang, like, matter had to have somehow shown up. You don't think matter's eternal, do you? You don't think it's always exist. So it had to show up somehow, and then like you can use the tone back on. It's like, and you think there was a Big Bang everywhere, and then particles started to form together, and over millions of years, they eventually started forming planets, and then atoms started to form. So carbon-based life can come into existence, but you had like this brown goopy protein that eventually single-celled organisms started to feast on. And those single-celled, they became 2, and then 4, and then 8, and then lightning struck it, and eventually you have fish swimming around. And if one day a fish said, you know what, I'm tired of the water. It's really wet. I want to be on land. And so it slowly developed lungs, and then it crawled up on land. It was like, this is better. And then eventually, like you say it like that, and you go, yeah, that sounds kind of foolish too, doesn't it? It's all in the tone, but like, here's the deal. For me, it all has to start with something, an unmoved mover, an uncaused cause, something to create all of this. And some people say, well, could God have used the Big Bang? I think he could have. I'm not going to argue like how God did everything that he did. That is not my goal. But if you don't have God at the beginning, creating everything and making everything happen, then you're missing a big part of that story. So if God creates everything, however he chooses to do it, if he creates everything in the beginning, how difficult is it for him to keep the world from spinning for a few hours so the sun can stand still for Joshua? Like if he created everything, it's not that hard for him. And so for me, it's like, yeah, I have no problem believing the miracles because I think God loves us enough to interact with humanity and do different things. And God is powerful enough that all this stuff is just like, it's easier for him to do that than it is for me to speak. Because that's how powerful God is. So if he created it all, he can do anything that he wants. So you may be like, I think that's kind of stupid and all this stuff. Like, I need to hear your alternative. Because I think it's a lot more stupid than what I believe. In fact, think of it this way. The mathematical odds of things. The human DNA code is so intricate and so long and so like, it's just like, oh my goodness, how does this just happen? It would be like if a tornado, because we're about to have warm weather. I hope we don't have tornadoes, but we might. A tornado ripping through Boyd, going through the sawmill, and it leaves a perfectly designed 2-story house in its wake. Painted yellow with a white picket fence, the whole nine. And you would go, wow, that tornado must have put that house there. You would say, oh, somebody just built a house. Because tornadoes don't bring order, tornadoes bring chaos. And you say, Doug, that's a little far-fetched. If you do the math on the odds of each of those things happening by chance, the numbers are in favor of the tornado building a house than for the human DNA code to be what it is just by natural selection. Okay, I'm jumping back in now. So if you believe something different, I'd love to hear your explanation of it. You're probably 1,000 times smarter than I am. I'll give you that. But I've read some people that are probably smarter than you. And that's where I get my source of information. And it's going to take faith either way. All right, the final way that God interacts with supernatural, spiritual events. These are events that happen outside of the laws of physics, outside of the laws of nature. They're events that are known but are ultimately unseen. And these are the most important of the 4 events that are listed. It's these types of events like, 1 Corinthians 5:17. If anyone is in Christ, they are a new creation. The old is gone, the new has come. When you come up out of the waters of baptism, you are a new creation. Now, like, we could take a look at you and be like, okay, Can you do more push-ups than you did before? Oh, you've got a third eye. Yep, that's the new creation piece right there. Like, you're not going to, like, see it physically. But spiritually, that person is a new creation. And they have moved from spiritual death to spiritual life, from being lost to found. That stuff is all actually happening, but it takes place in a spiritual reality. It's known to us because the Bible teaches on it, but in many ways it is unseen. Now, you may see the fruits of it eventually, but that comes later. In fact, all the spiritual gifts, like the gift of teaching, the gift of mercy, the gift of administration, whatever the spiritual gifts are, you don't see how it happens, you just see the manifestation of it. In fact, even Jesus, with his atoning sacrifice for the sins, you may wonder, how in the world does Jesus' one sacrifice cover the sins for the entire world? It is a supernatural spiritual event. When Jesus dies, his blood figuratively covers all the sins of the world. You don't see it happen. That would be kind of gross if you were honest and you saw blood everywhere. It is a figurative thing to say Jesus' sacrifice covers your sins. So the supernatural spiritual events, the events are known, but they're not necessarily detectable by the human eye. And I say these are the most important because this impacts eternity. This impacts where people spend forever, either within or apart from God's presence. Now, as we think about all this, we try to bring it home. And you think, why did I need to know all the categories, and why did I need to know there are 4? And couldn't you just summarize this a little better? Is this going to be on a test? If I stand before the judgment, is the question going to be, give me the 4 ways that I interacted with the physical world? Oh, good, Doug preached on this once. I remember this. I'm going to put these on. Why is this important? Because here's what you need to know. Because God is constantly interacting with us in a good way. So we wouldn't be around if it wasn't for Christ, general providence. You wouldn't be who you are and live where you are if it wasn't for specific providence. Miraculous events have been testimonies throughout the ages that have pointed back to this testimony of Jesus and his story that ultimately goes to the foundation of the church. And then supernatural spiritual events, man, that's all around. I mean, you think about even you're praying for someone to kind of get it, to surrender their life to Jesus. When they do so, that is a supernatural spiritual event. I'm praying constantly for people in my life that don't know Jesus. I'm praying for our country in general. I'm praying for our world. And if anything happens for the good in those areas, those are supernatural spiritual events. God is constantly moving and acting and doing things behind the scenes and sometimes front and center on our behalf. And that should really encourage us. Because there are times where we may not like ourselves too much. There may be times where we drop the ball in some big area in our life. And it's man, I just feel like giving up. I just feel like this is pointless. And I just feel like this is stupid. And you're angry at the world, or you're frustrated, you're depressed. But you need to know God has not and will never give up on you. And there are times where you're just overjoyed, something good's happened and something big's happened, and you're just so thankful. Make sure you direct your thanksgiving back to God, because he's the one behind the scenes working through all of it. And so whenever you stop and think about how much God does for us, 99.99% of it we don't even see and we don't even realize. And that happens because he loves you more than I can put into words. And even if I could put it into words, our feeble minds of human beings couldn't even comprehend it. This is who God is, and this is the God that we serve. And when we talk about next week, when we do the scouting report, we talk about the devil, we talk about demons, which is kind of it's kind of weird. I may not come back, Doug. I may just watch The Exorcist or something and just get my information from there. Don't watch, that's a freaky movie, by the way. Don't watch that one. But listen, that stuff, that's weird and it's freaky, but it's also reality. And we got to be mindful of it. But this is the backdrop. This is the foundation for everything moving forward. Because when you know everything that God does for you, it doesn't matter who the enemy is or what the enemy tries to do, ultimately. The one who's with you is stronger than the one who stands against you. Always. Because God trumps everybody else.
you.